The forest had never felt so suffocating. It was a dense maze of twisted trees, their skeletal branches clawing at the sky, shrouded in a thick, misty darkness that devoured the last traces of daylight. Daniel Monroe trudged through the underbrush, his boots crunching against dead leaves, his breath coming in slow, measured puffs. He had always found solace in these woods, a quiet retreat from the noise of the world. But tonight, something felt wrong. A strange sound cut through the silence, a faint, wailing cry. Daniel froze, his pulse quickening. The cry was distant, but unmistakable. A baby's cry. His instincts told him to turn back. Nothing good ever came from wandering too deep into these woods. But the sound clawed at his conscience, a helpless infant crying out in the dark. He pressed forward, weaving through the trees as the cries grew louder, more desperate. Then he saw it, a clearing, bathed in an eerie, silvery glow from the moon above. And in the middle of it, a bundle of cloth, moving. Daniel stepped closer, his heart hammering in his chest. As he neared, his breath caught in his throat. Wrapped around the bundle, coiled in a grotesque embrace, was a massive snake. The serpent was impossibly large, its scales shimmering like liquid shadow. Its body coiled tightly around the small, squirming form within the bundle. But the baby, it wasn't struggling. It was calm. Daniel's mind raced. How was the child still alive? The snake should have crushed the life from its tiny body, but instead, it seemed almost protective. The infant's wide, glassy eyes stared up at him, unblinking, eerily aware. He needed to act. Now, summoning every ounce of courage, Daniel grabbed the thickest branch he could find and lunged forward, swinging it at the snake with all his might. The impact was solid, but instead of recoiling, the snake merely lifted its massive head, its slitted golden eyes locking onto his. A slow, deliberate hiss escaped its mouth. Daniel barely had time to react before the serpent moved. Faster than he thought possible, it uncoiled from the baby and lunged at him. He stumbled backward, barely dodging its snapping jaws. The creature was unnatural, too fast, too intelligent. It didn't move like any snake he had ever seen. And then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, the snake stopped. It lifted its head, its forked tongue flickering as if tasting the air. A moment of unbearable silence passed. Then, with an eerie, almost reluctant grace, it slithered away into the darkness, disappearing between the trees. Daniel didn't wait to question why. He dropped the branch and rushed forward, scooping up the baby in his arms. The infant was warm, its small fingers curling around the fabric of his jacket. A strange, floral scent clung to its skin, something ancient and unplaceable. As he held the child, a deep unease settled over him. There was something profoundly unnatural about the whole scene. He had expected the baby to be frightened, crying, anything, but it simply stared at him, its gaze unwavering. Something wasn't right. Daniel took a shaky breath, adjusting his grip on the infant. He needed to get out of here, now. But as he turned to leave, a whisper, almost too faint to hear, carried through the trees. Not a human voice, not a sound the wind could have made, but something else, and it was calling his name. Daniel's grip on the baby tightened as the whisper slithered through the trees. It wasn't the rustling of leaves or the sigh of the wind. It was something deliberate, a voice, distant yet unmistakable, speaking his name. His instincts screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. The forest, once familiar, now felt impossibly vast, stretching endlessly in all directions. Shadows moved where they shouldn't, the trees swayed without wind, and the air was thick with something he couldn't name, an invisible weight pressing against his chest. Then, the baby in his arms did something that sent ice through his veins. It smiled, not the innocent, toothless grin of an infant, but something else. Something knowing. Daniel swallowed hard. He needed to get out of here. Now! He turned, forcing himself to move, to push through the underbrush as fast as he could. The forest was different, wrong, as if the paths had shifted. Every direction looked unfamiliar, twisted. He had walked these woods 1,000 times, but now it was as though the forest itself didn't want to let him go. Behind him, something was following. The sound was subtle at first, a whisper of movement through the leaves. But it grew. The snapping of twigs, the deliberate crunch of footsteps. Daniel didn't look back. The baby was unnervingly quiet in his arms, its head resting against his chest, as if it were listening to something only it could hear. Then the air shifted. A deep, rhythmic hissing came from behind him. Daniel knew without turning that the snake, the impossible, massive serpent from before, had returned. And this time, it wasn't alone. The trees around him pulsed with life. Shadows swayed, shapes slithered, unseen eyes watched. The air carried a strange, floral scent, the same one that clung to the child's skin. It was thick, heady, almost suffocating. He pushed forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The trees twisted around him, the path warping beneath his feet. It was like trying to escape a nightmare. And then finally he saw it, the edge of the forest. The dim glow of his cabin's porch light flickered through the trees. Relief surged through him, and he sprinted forward, half stumbling as the ground beneath him seemed to shift. As he reached the clearing, he dared one final glance over his shoulder. The snake was there, but it wasn't alone. Figures stood in the darkness, tall, in human shapes with hollow, glowing eyes. They lingered just beyond the tree line, half concealed by the shifting shadows. They did not move, did not breathe. They only watched, and in the middle of them, the snake sat coiled, its golden eyes burning with something ancient and unreadable. Daniel didn't wait to understand. He slammed the door behind him, bolting it shut. His chest heaved, his skin damp with sweat. The baby. He looked down at the child, expecting to see fear. But there was none. It was still smiling. A slow, deliberate grin. And then softly, it whispered his name. Daniel stood frozen in his cabin, his breath shallow as the baby nestled in his arms. Outside, the forest remained eerily silent. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. The baby's voice still echoed in his ears. Daniel, it was impossible. Infants didn't speak, especially not in that unsettling, knowing tone. His hands trembled as he carefully placed the child onto the worn couch, stepping back as if putting distance between them would make sense of what had just happened. The baby only stared at him, its deep green eyes glistening in the dim light. Then, as if sensing his fear, its lips parted again. "Thank you." Daniel stumbled back, knocking into the wooden table behind him. His mind struggled to process the words. "No," he muttered. This isn't right." The baby only smiled. His heart pounded. The forest had already warped into something unnatural. And now this, a speaking infant, was sitting in his home, staring at him with something far beyond human comprehension. Daniel forced himself to breathe. He had to think. He needed help. Anyone, who could explain this. His phone. He lunged for it, grabbing it off the table and quickly dialing the nearest town's emergency line. His fingers were unsteady, sweat slicking the device as he pressed it to his ear. But before the first ring could even finish, the baby laughed, a light, melodic giggle. Innocent, sweet, but Daniel felt it, a ripple in the air, like the room itself had shifted. And then, the call failed. The screen went black. The battery dead. Daniel's stomach twisted. He had just charged it that morning. His eyes flicked to the baby. It sat there, tiny hands curled into fists, watching him with an expression that shouldn't be possible for something so small. A slow realization crept over him. He wasn't in control anymore. Something else was. And then he noticed it. The baby's sleeve had slipped slightly, revealing its fragile little wrist. But it wasn't the pale, delicate skin that made Daniel's blood run cold. It was the mark, a black sigil, inked into the baby's flesh. Daniel didn't recognize the symbols, but something deep in his bones did. This was old, older than the forest, older than him, older than anything he could comprehend. And as he stared, transfixed by the twisting shapes of the sigil, the baby let out a small, contented sigh, and the mark moved. Daniel's breath hitched. His vision swam as the sigil twisted and writhed beneath the baby's skin, like something was crawling just beneath the surface. Then, a knock at the door. Daniel jolted, snapping his gaze away from the baby. Another knock, louder this time, more urgent. His pulse thundered in his ears. No one ever came this deep into the woods, especially not at this hour. He moved cautiously, glancing through the peephole, and felt his stomach drop. A woman stood on his porch. Not just any woman. She was tall, her skin too pale, her hair long and black, hanging over her shoulders in thick, unkempt strands. Her eyes, too large, too dark, bore into the door as if she could already see him behind it. And she was smiling. Not warmly, not kindly. It was a knowing smile, a smile that sent ice through his veins. She raised her hand and knocked again. Knock, knock. Daniel swallowed. Every instinct screamed at him not to open the door. But then, the baby let out a soft coo. Daniel turned, only to find the child now staring directly at the door, waiting, and in a voice far too calm, far too unnatural, it whispered, "She's here." Daniel's fingers hovered over the door handle, his breath shallow. The woman outside hadn't moved, her presence pressing against the thin barrier of wood like something waiting to seep through. Behind him, the baby, if it was a baby, watched silently, its green eyes dark with unreadable knowledge. "She's here." Daniel swallowed hard. He should have left. He should have never picked up the child in the forest. But it was too late for regret. The woman knocked again. Knock, knock. The sound was slow, deliberate. "I don't know who you are," Daniel called out, his voice hoarse. "But you need to leave." A moment of silence stretched between them. Then, a whisper slithered through the door. Daniel, his stomach clenched. She knew his name. The baby made a soft sound, almost a giggle, and Daniel turned to find it grinning. The sigil on its wrist twisted again, writhing like something alive. And then, the door unlocked. Not by Daniel's hand. The deadbolt clicked, the knob turning on its own. His breath caught. He hadn't touched it. The door creaked open just an inch, just enough for him to see. The woman's mouth, too wide, too full of teeth. Daniel lurched backward, just as the door swung open completely, revealing the woman in full. She was taller than she should have been, her limbs slightly too long, her skin pale like something that had never seen sunlight. And those black eyes, they weren't eyes at all. They were pits, empty voids that seemed to pull the air around them. She stepped inside. Daniel's instinct screamed, but his body wouldn't move. Something held him in place. The baby let out a soft sigh, stretching its tiny hands toward the woman. She smiled down at it. "Finally," she murmured. "I've waited so long." Daniel's muscles tensed, a surge of panic breaking through whatever invisible force held him. "What do you want?" His voice shook. "Who the hell are you?" The woman turned to him, tilting her head too far to the side, her neck cracking unnaturally. "I am the mother," she said simply. Daniel's skin crawled. "That's not your child." The woman's expression didn't change. "But it is." She stepped closer, her presence wrong, like the air itself warped around her. "You don't understand, Daniel." Her voice was soft, almost pitying. "This child doesn't belong to you. It never did." She reached out, her long fingers brushing the baby's forehead. And then, everything shifted. The walls of the cabin shuddered. The furniture blurred. Daniel's vision warped as the world around him cracked like fragile glass. A horrible, twisting pain lanced through his skull, and suddenly, he remembered. He saw flashes of the forest. Not how it had looked when he found the baby, but how it had been before. A circle of stones, an altar deep in the trees, and him, kneeling before it, chanting words he didn't understand. His own hands had drawn the sigil, not on a baby, on flesh much older. A sacrifice, a deal, a promise. The baby was never abandoned. It was placed there for him to find, and he had taken it, just as he was meant to. Daniel's breath hitched as he snapped back to the present, his mind reeling. "No," he whispered. "No, that's not." But the woman only gazed at him with something almost like affection. "It's time," she said. "You kept your end of the bargain. Now let him go." Daniel's entire body went rigid as the baby turned to look at him one last time. And then it spoke, not with the child's voice, but with something ancient. "Thank you, Daniel." The sigil on its wrist burned with light, and the air in the cabin collapsed in on itself. Daniel didn't even have time to scream. Everything went dark. Daniel's eyes snapped open. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he was still alive. The cabin was gone. The woman was gone. The baby. He sat up too fast, his head pounding. Where was he? He was outside, lying in the dirt beneath towering trees. The same forest where he had found the baby. But something was wrong. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something rotting. The trees around him weren't just trees anymore. Their trunks were twisted, their bark resembling writhing flesh. And then, a sound, low, hissing. Daniel turned his head and saw it. The snake. But this was no ordinary serpent. It was massive, coiled in the undergrowth like a living nightmare. Its scales shimmered in unnatural hues, shifting between deep green and glistening black, as if its body were composed of liquid shadow. Its eyes, the same green as the baby's. Daniel's breath hitched as the snake uncoiled itself, its body stretching longer than a bus, its head rising high enough to brush the lowest branches. And then, in a voice too human, it spoke. "You remember now, don't you?" The sound crawled through his bones. Daniel's hands trembled as memories crashed over him. The ritual, the deal. He had been chosen. Years ago, the baby hadn't been placed in the forest for him to save. It had been placed there to seal his fate, and he had played his part perfectly. "What are you?" Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. The snake's mouth stretched wide, wider than any creature should be able to. Inside, nestled within the cavern of its gaping maw, was something else. A shape, a child, the baby. It lay there, its tiny body curled within the serpent's mouth, its green eyes staring directly at him. "You already know," the snake whispered. Daniel did know. This thing, this being was older than time. It had many forms. It had existed long before humans ever walked upright. And he had served it before, 1,000 lifetimes ago. The sigil, the altar, the ritual. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. "You belong to me, Daniel," the voice slithered through his mind. "You always have." Daniel tried to move, to run, but his body was no longer his own. The sigil was still there, not on the baby this time, but on his own flesh. Burning, spreading, consuming. His mouth opened in a silent scream as his skin cracked apart, revealing scales beneath. He was changing. No, he was returning to what he had always been. The snake's coils tightened around him, pulling him into the dark. And then, silence. Days later, a hiker wandered through the forest, drawn by the whispers of something unseen. And there, lying in the undergrowth, was a baby, abandoned, wrapped in the embrace of a giant snake. The hiker's breath caught. The baby's green eyes blinked up at him. And on its tiny wrist, a sigil, waiting for the next one, waiting for the cycle to begin again.